The tank should have been drifting backwards. Instead, in the pale winter light over an English river, it inched forward, pushing a small bow wave against the current. On the far bank, a line of soldiers, engineers, and officers stood in silence, their breath hanging in the air like cigarette smoke. No one cheered. Not yet. They simply watched the impossible struggle of 40 tons of steel trying to climb a river. The men on the bank knew the numbers. The current was fast. The tank was heavy. By every safe calculation, it should, at best, hold position. At worst, it should spin sideways, capsize, and vanish beneath the brown water. Instead, the strange machine kept moving, canvas screen raised around its hull like a skirt, twin propellers churning a froth just below the surface. Near the water's edge, a thin, tired-looking captain with oil under his fingernails and a notebook in his hand did not watch the tank. He watched the river. His name was Captain Arthur Miles, Royal Engineers. He was not the man who invented the idea of a swimming tank. That honor belonged to others. But he was the man the War Office had quietly tasked with answering a new, more specific question. Not just, can a tank swim? But, can a tank swim upstream? The question had been born not in a laboratory, but on a map. Months earlier, in a dim War Office room in London, a group of officers had stood over a table littered with charts. France, the Low Countries, Germany. Blue veins of rivers cut across the landscape. The Seine, the Meuse, the Rhine, and a dozen smaller tributaries. Some would have to be crossed in a hurry. Bridges would be blown. Pontoon units could be delayed or destroyed. The planners knew that if armor could cross water under its own power, it might save thousands of lives. The first Duplex Drive tanks, the so-called D.D. Shermans and Valentines, had already proved they could cross lakes and calm coastal waters. They could be launched from landing craft, swim towards a beach, drop their canvas screens, and fight as normal tanks. But on moving water, in a real river, with a strong current, they faltered. They were designed to float. They were not designed to climb. That was where Arthur Miles came in. He had been dragged into amphibious engineering almost by accident. Before the war, he had been a civil engineer, designing river locks and small hydroelectric installations. He knew currents and eddies the way gunners knew trajectories. In 1942, he had been commissioned, handed a uniform, and told to make himself useful. Useful, it turned out, meant standing in cold water next to experimental machines that leaked, groaned, and sometimes sank without warning. By late 1943, at a remote training area cut from woodland and marsh, Miles and his small team had been given a specific directive. Find a way for a tank to make headway against a river current of at least 2 knots. The numbers did not like the idea. A medium tank weighed around 30 tons, more with special fittings. Water dragged at every surface. The propulsion system, twin marine propellers, driven from the tank's engine through a complex transmission, had limits. The hull form of a Sherman, even shrouded by a canvas flotation screen, was never going to be as efficient as a proper boat. On paper, it was a bad bargain. The river would win. Arthur did not entirely trust paper. He trusted rivers because they lied in familiar ways. They looked smooth from the bank, but up close they had seams, invisible threads of faster and slower water. Behind every bend, past every obstruction, there were pockets of turbulence and calm. A river might be a single line on a map, but in reality it was dozens of streams woven together. If a man understood that, he thought, perhaps a tank could learn to use it. The first tests had been humiliating. They had taken a modified Sherman DD, fitted with a slightly uprated propeller system, and launched it from a muddy slipway into a river in the Midlands. The current was modest, less than they would face on the continent. The tank floated, churned the water, and for a beautiful 30 seconds seemed to hold its ground. Then the bow swung. The canvas screen became a sail. The hull turned broadside to the flow. The tank drifted, helpless, until the safety cables snapped taut and nearly yanked 2 sappers into the water. Inside the turret, the commander, a young lieutenant from the 79th Armored Division, had sworn so loudly the safety officer wrote it down in his report. In the second test, they tried a different approach. More power. They pushed the engine to higher revs, drove the propellers harder, and set the driver to full ahead. The tank fought valiantly for a minute, then began to overheat. Steam curled from the engine deck. The driver reported a smell like burning clutch and roast beef. They could not simply bully the river. After that, there had been quiet meetings in drafty huts. Higher-ups muttered about wasting time. They pointed out that the DD tanks were already difficult enough to deploy in calm water. Perhaps it was unreasonable to demand that they fight a current as well. Perhaps this requirement should be removed from the list. Miles argued that it could not be removed from reality. "The Germans will not choose only gentle rivers for us," he had said, standing in front of a group of senior officers, his uniform still damp from that morning's test. "If the current takes our tanks, it will not care that the specification was optimistic." He had not raised his voice. He did not need to. On the wall behind him, a large map showed the Rhine, wide and blue, with a series of penciled arrows pointing eastward. Every man in the room knew what those arrows meant. Reluctantly, they gave him more time. It turned out the answer did not begin with more power. It began with the hull's attitude in the water. One evening, after another frustrating day of trials, Miles stood alone on the riverbank as the light drained from the sky. The tank had been hauled back onto the slipway. The sappers had gone to brew tea. Quiet settled over the training ground. Only the river moved, a steady dark band between the frost-rimmed reeds. He watched the current curl around a half-submerged log. The water divided, split, then rejoined. Downstream, there was a patch of water that stayed strangely calm, even as the rest of the river rushed by. A childish memory surfaced, uninvited. Leaves in a village stream, the way some would stall in small eddies behind stones. It was a simple thing. He had seen it 1,000 times. For some reason tonight, it refused to leave his mind. He walked down to the edge, boots sinking into the soft bank. The river tugged gently at a rope tied to a mooring ring. Miles crouched, following the line with his eyes, tracking how the current pulled and slipped around it. The tank, he realized, had been fighting the river as if it were a flat, uniform wall of water. But the river was not a wall. It was a structure. The next morning, he called his team into the small workshop hut. "We have been thinking like tankers," he said, pointing at a crude chalk sketch of a hull on the blackboard. "We need to think like ferrymen." He proposed 3 changes. First, minor adjustments to the flotation screen and front trim so that the tank's bow rode a little higher, slicing the surface instead of pushing it. Second, a revised rudder arrangement, allowing the driver finer control over angle relative to the current. And third, a change not in hardware but in doctrine, how the tank entered and used the flow. Instead of pointing straight at the opposite bank and hoping for the best, the driver would work at a deliberate angle, using the fastest part of the current to help turn the hull just enough to create a small area of reduced pressure along one side. It was not quite surfing, and not quite ferry gliding, as rivermen knew it, but it borrowed from both. On the blackboard, it looked almost trivial. To the men who would sit inside 40 tons of floating steel, it did not feel trivial at all. In the weeks that followed, they modified a test vehicle accordingly. The sappers cursed the cold, the mud, and the need to cut and reseal the canvas so many times. Mechanics worked by the light of hooded lamps, fingers numb, tools slipping from gloved hands. The war did not pause while they experimented. Trains of troops and supplies thundered past within earshot, heading for ports, for airfields, for other fronts. Word spread, in the sideways manner of army rumor, that some boffin is trying to make a tank go uphill in water. Some laughed, some shook their heads. A few, especially those who had seen DD tanks sink off training beaches, quietly wished him luck. Now, on this gray morning by the river, all of that work was being tested. The modified Sherman sat low in the water, its canvas screen taut, the top of its turret barely visible above the fabric wall. A white line had been painted on the far bank, marking the point they hoped, not dared, just hoped, it might reach before the engine overheated or the current beat it. Inside the hull, the driver, Sergeant Tom Barker, stared at the small sliver of river he could see through his periscope. His hands rested on the control levers, light but steady. He had practiced the new entry angle in calm water. He had practiced in a gentle artificial flow created by sluice gates. But this was the first time he would do it in a real river, one whose moods were not controlled by any man. On the bank, Miles stood with his notebook closed. There was nothing left to calculate. "Ready when you are, Sergeant," he called, his voice carrying flat across the water. The tank's engine note rose, a deep, strained growl that vibrated in the air. The twin propellers bit harder. The bow shifted, the hull nudging into the faster thread of current. For a second, the tank seemed to shudder in place, caught between competing forces. Then, very slowly, the white-painted stones on the far bank began to move. Not because they actually moved, but because the tank did. Half a meter, more. The current pushed. The propellers answered. The new trim held the bow just high enough to keep it from digging in. The adjusted rudders kept the hull at a slight, deliberate angle, stealing a little lift from the flow itself. To an untrained eye, it looked like a small, almost pathetic progress. To Arthur Miles, it looked like the beginning of an answer. Around him, the watching officers said nothing. They did not want to break whatever fragile balance was at work out there. The tank continued its slow, stubborn climb up the river, leaving a wake that was more suggestion than wave. Steam began to wisp faintly from the engine deck. Time stretched. A bird crossed the sky, unbothered by human anxieties. When the tank finally eased its nose towards the far bank, the white line was no longer directly opposite the launch point. It was a little downstream. Not much. Just a short walk, if you were a man with dry boots. For a tank that was supposed to lose outright to the river, it was more than enough. Arthur let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He did not smile. Instead, he wrote a single line in his notebook. First sustained upstream progress achieved. Repeat under heavier conditions. The river gurgled softly at his feet, as indifferent as ever. They had proved, today, that a tank could inch its way against a modest current without surrendering. It was not dramatic. It was not a miracle. It was the sort of quiet, incremental victory that never made headlines. But the war, he knew, would be decided by a long chain of such unremarkable miracles. Farther east, on the maps, the blue lines of greater rivers waited. The Rhine, the Scheldt. The crossings that would decide whether Allied armor could break into the heart of Germany at speed or be held at the water's edge. And somewhere in that future, he thought, there would be another morning like this one. A river running cold and fast, men watching from a bank, a tank easing itself into the water, trusting not in luck, but in someone's careful understanding of how steel and current could be persuaded to work together. Today had shown that persuasion was possible. The next tests would show what price it demanded. The river was different the next morning. A harder wind blew across its surface, flattening the small ripples into long, dark streaks. The current seemed faster, though no one had measured it yet. The sky hung low and colorless, as if waiting to see whether yesterday had been a fluke or the first hint of something real. Captain Arthur Miles arrived before anyone else. He stood at the same bend in the river where the test tank had made its slow, stubborn climb the day before. The mud still bore the deep tracks of the recovery vehicle. Frost had crystallized along the reeds, fragile as spun glass. The world was quiet enough that he could hear the faint creak of ice forming along the shallows. He liked arriving early. A river in the first minutes of daylight spoke truths that charts never captured. Its surface revealed seams. Its edges revealed tensions. The water told him whether today would fight harder or easier than yesterday. It was colder now. The flow felt tighter. If the tank struggled yesterday, it would suffer today. Good, he thought. If it worked only in ideal conditions, it was useless. Footsteps crunched behind him. Sergeant Tom Barker approached, hands jammed deep in his gloves, cap pulled low. "You want to try it again this morning, sir?" he asked, glancing at the water as if it might bite. "Yes," Miles said simply, "but today we go in farther downstream." Barker raised an eyebrow. "To give the river more time to fight us?" Miles nodded. "If it can't survive that, we need to know before we waste more nights in the workshop." Barker didn't argue. He never did. He had the quiet confidence of men who trusted physics only when it behaved, and instinct when it didn't. Today, the river didn't behave at all. By the time the rest of the team arrived, engineers, sappers, 2 officers from the 79th Armored Division, and a transport crew, the wind had picked up. It hissed across the water, darkening its color and sharpening its movements. The tank was rolled into position, its canvas screen freshly inspected for leaks, its propellers greased, its engine warmed. A young lieutenant from the Armored Division studied the river with suspicion. "This is faster than yesterday," he muttered. "About a knot faster," Miles said. "Good for the experiment." "Good for sinking another tank," the lieutenant said under his breath. Miles pretended not to hear it. He walked around the Sherman, checking the seams of the flotation screen, tapping the metal brackets with his knuckles. Everything was as close to perfect as wartime improvisation allowed. But machinery was never the real variable. The river was. And today, it wanted to win. "Entry angle is the same?" Barker asked from the driver's hatch. "No," Miles said. 2 degrees sharper, and hold her at that angle longer before correcting. That'll bring more water against the bow." "Yes," Miles agreed. "But it'll also let the river create that low-pressure pocket sooner." He could tell Barker didn't like the idea, but the sergeant nodded. He had been inside this tank when the river tried to spin it. He understood that they were not refining a machine. They were taming a force with its own temperament. The men moved to their stations. Cables tightened. The tank rolled forward with a metallic groan. The canvas skirt rustled as the cold wind pressed and lifted its edges. "Release," Miles ordered. The Sherman slid into the river with a heavy, wet sigh, like a beast returning to its den. Water surged up the screen, then steadied. The tank floated, but only just. The hull sat lower than yesterday, weighed down by new modifications. Inside, Barker wrestled gently with the controls, feeling the response through vibrations more than through sight. "Propellers ahead," Miles called. The river responded first. It grabbed at the hull, eager to spin the tank sideways. The bow dipped slightly, caught by a fast seam of water. "Easy," Miles murmured, not to Barker, but to the river itself. Barker corrected the angle. The adjusted rudders bit into the flow. The tank shivered, not violently, but with the sense of a creature trying to find its footing on uneven ground. From the bank, the officers watched in tense silence. The lieutenant folded his arms. "It's losing it," he said. "The current's got the bow." "No," Miles replied softly. "Not yet." He saw something the others didn't, the faint diagonal movement of a wake that hinted the hull was aligning with a faster thread of water. Barker must have sensed it too, because he eased power instead of increasing it. The tank drifted half a meter downstream, then held as if pinned to an invisible axis. "There," Miles whispered. The next few seconds decided everything. Barker increased throttle. The propellers churned harder. The bow lifted a fraction. That tiny lift broke the surface differently, shedding drag along one side. The river, tricked by the angle, flowed past the hull in a pattern no one on the bank could see, but Barker felt clearly. Forward motion began. Slow, agonizing, almost cruel, but real. The tank clawed its way upstream in short, hesitant movements. Every gain was followed by a slip, but the slips grew smaller. The river no longer controlled the hull. The hull was beginning to negotiate terms. The lieutenant exhaled through clenched teeth. "I'll be damned." Miles said nothing. He was counting. 10 meters, 12, 14. At 15 meters, the tank faltered. The bow dipped. The screen shivered. The current surged, eager to reclaim its victory. "Hold her there, Barker!" Miles shouted, louder than he intended. Inside the hull, Barker clenched the controls, sweat beading on his temples despite the cold. He eased the left rudder, nudged the engine speed, and shifted the nose a hair's width toward the calmer slip of water near the far bank. The tank responded gradually, like a stubborn horse choosing not to throw its rider. It stabilized. And then, unbelievably, began climbing again. A new sound rose from the tank, the long, low growl of a machine pushed close to its limits. Steam lifted off the engine deck, curling against the cold air. Miles checked his watch. They had gone upstream longer than any previous attempt. Twice as long. 3 times. The tank reached the painted marker. It did not stop. It moved past it. Further than yesterday. Further than anyone had thought remotely possible. When Barker finally angled toward the far bank and cut power, the tank drifted to a halt. The river, almost offended, slapped lightly against its side. The officers on the bank began whispering. "It's workable," one said. "That's upstream in real current," said another. "It could cross the Rhine." "Not yet," Miles interrupted. They looked at him. For a moment he seemed almost annoyed, though not with them. "It works on this river," he said. "On this day, with this current. But war will not give us these conditions." He stepped closer to the water's edge, studying the tank's wake, memorizing how the river had been fooled this time. "We need to test in floodwater," he said, "and at night, and with wind from the opposite direction, and with the shoreline changed, and with more weight inside the hull, and—" The lieutenant cut him off. "Captain Miles, you've just shown a tank can swim against a strong river. No one thought that was even possible." Miles looked at the tank, its canvas screen dripping, its engine ticking as it cooled. Possible was not enough. Not for what awaited across those blue lines on the map. "We're not done," Miles said quietly. and in his mind, already, the next obstacles were forming. Darker water, colder nights, stronger currents. The river had yielded a secret today. Tomorrow, it would demand a price for it. The river changed its temperament long before the men noticed. The wind stiffened. The current tightened into long, dark ribbons that ran faster than the day before. Frost clung to the reeds in pale crystals, and the air carried the metallic scent that preceded winter storms. The tank crew arrived tired, boots heavy with old mud, but ready to face whatever the water offered. They did not yet know the river had decided to fight back. Captain Arthur Miles stood at the bend again, studying how the surface shifted in overlapping bands. Yesterday's triumph meant nothing today. Rivers did not honor past victories. They remembered only what you asked of them right now, and they tested men accordingly. Sergeant Tom Barker joined him quietly, hands buried deep in his gloves. "You think she'll hold in this current?" Barker asked. Miles didn't answer at once. He watched how the wind pushed the water off balance, how the chop angled unpredictably against the flow. "She'll hold if we do our part," he finally said, "and if the river allows it." Barker exhaled, not reassured but accepting. They had no permission to wait for better weather. What they were preparing for, fast crossings under stress, would not happen in kind conditions. If this tank could not survive rough water in England, it would not survive anything on the Rhine. Men from the 79th Armored Division arrived next, followed by Major Henry Selkirk of the War Office. Selkirk inspected the river with visible dislike, as if nature itself had violated a regulation. He glanced repeatedly at his watch, each movement an unspoken question about results, deadlines, and expectations. "Captain Miles," Selkirk said, his voice flat, "I hope today's trial will provide clarity. We need to know if this upstream capability is worth the effort." Miles kept his expression neutral. "Clarity is exactly what we're after, sir." The tank was rolled into position. Canvas screen tightened and checked. Its hull was a little heavier now, loaded to mimic combat weight. Ammunition, spare gear, everything that pushed the flotation closer to its limits. Barker climbed inside, settling into the cramped driver's position. The world outside was cold. The world inside smelled of oil, metal, damp canvas, and fear kept politely beneath the surface. The current swirled faster than the day before. Even from the bank, everyone could feel the river's pull. "Release," Miles ordered. The Sherman slid into the water and dipped lower than usual, the weight pressing the flotation screen almost to its threshold. For a moment it floated steadily. Then the wind struck, and the canvas quivered like a living thing. Barker increased throttle. The propellers churned. The tank tried to hold its angle, but the river surged sideways, pressing hard against the exposed screen. "Correcting," Barker called from inside. Miles felt tension climb through every muscle. The tank's bow dipped under a sharp gust. Water slapped the fabric in a hard, diagonal sheet. Barker adjusted again. The river pushed back harder. Instability crept in, quiet at first, then unmistakable. "Hold her there," Miles said sharply. The tank trembled. The canvas bulged inward. The hull turned a fraction too far. Barker fought it, hand steady but jaw tight. The river sensed weakness and took it. The bow slammed down. A surge of water rolled across the front of the screen. The staff officers stepped back instinctively. "Cut power," Miles shouted, but the order came an instant too late. The screen collapsed inward with a violent snap, folding like a tent struck by a gale. Water poured in, dragging the bow down with terrifying speed. Inside the tank, Barker felt the change instantly, the sudden heaviness, the angle shift, the sound of the world rushing in. "Emergency release!" the commander yelled, shoving at the hatch. The hull tipped forward, nose diving under the surface. The river surged over the screen, filling the flotation chamber. The sappers on the bank sprinted with ropes, shouting over the roar of the water. The safety cables stretched tight, then snapped with a gunshot crack, flinging spray across the bank. Inside the sinking tank, Barker clawed toward the hatch as freezing water rose past his ankles. The commander forced the hatch upward. It jammed. He slammed his shoulder into it. It opened just as the tank lurched under another surge. Water gushed in behind them, chasing their heels. Barker squeezed through the hatch, coughing as he broke into open air. The commander followed a second later. Behind them, the Sherman dipped once, twice, then vanished beneath the brown water in a single, terrible motion, swallowed whole by the river that had tolerated them for so long, and now refused to hold them up even 1 second longer. Silence followed, the kind that presses against the ears. Only the disturbed foam curled where the tank had been. The rescue crew hauled the soaked, shaking men onto the bank. Barker collapsed, breathing hard, his hands trembling with shock. The commander sat in the mud, staring at the surface of the water as though the tank might rise again. It would not. Miles reached Barker and crouched beside him. "You're alive. That's what matters." Barker shook his head. "It wasn't the tank, sir. It was the water. I could feel it pulling, like it wanted the hull under." Miles didn't dismiss it. He knew the sensation. Rivers pulled differently when they were angry. They gripped, they twisted, they punished mistakes. And today, the river had not forgiven even a small one. A sapper approached, pale and unsettled. "Sir, the screen tore right along the frame. Wind forced it." Miles absorbed the words slowly. "So it wasn't driver error?" "No, sir. Nothing could have corrected once it folded." Major Selkirk joined them, expression tight. "Captain Miles, I need to know whether this project is still viable." Miles looked out at the river, at the foam still circling over the spot where the tank had gone under. He thought of the weeks of work, the promise of upstream movement, the lives pushing steel through water. Then he thought of the Rhine, wide, cold, unpredictable, and the thousands who would rely on decisions made here. "It's viable," Miles said quietly, "but only if we stop pretending power alone will beat a river." Selkirk frowned. "What does that mean?" "That we don't lose to the current," Miles answered. "We lose to instability." Evening fell slowly. The wind softened, as if exhausted by its violence. The river returned to its usual steady flow, calm and indifferent to the steel lying on its bed. The crews left one by one. Only Miles remained, standing where the tank had disappeared. He crouched, dipped his hand into the cold water, and let it run through his fingers. Weight, balance, trim, hull angle, prop thrust, canvas tension. All of it mattered. But none of it mattered as much as this. The machine must never let instability begin, not even for a heartbeat. The tank could fight the current, but the river would always try to take advantage of chaos at the edges. Solutions formed in his mind: stronger framing for the screen, redistributed ballast, modifications to the bow trim, and a new control approach for drivers. War demanded certainty, but rivers offered none. They had to build a machine that did not fear disorder. Miles stood, wiping the cold from his hand. Tomorrow, the river would test them again. And this time, it would not take anything from them. The sun never truly rose that morning. It only thinned the darkness into a cold gray veil that settled over the training ground, like the memory of a night that refused to end. The river moved with a slow, heavy determination. Not violent now, but deep and full, carrying the weight of recent rain from miles upstream. It looked calmer than the day the tank went under, but to Arthur Miles it seemed more dangerous. Quiet rivers hid their intentions. The recovery crew had worked through most of the night to lift the sunken Sherman from the riverbed. It emerged coated in silt, canvas shredded, its hull bearing the scrape marks of stones dragged along during the descent. The sight of it, dripping river water onto the frost-covered bank, put a hush over the men. Machines could be patched and replaced, but the memory of watching one vanish still clung to everyone's nerves. Barker stood beside the recovered tank, arms folded, jaw tight. He had refused to take the day off. His uniform was still damp around the sleeves from when he helped with the ropes. "You don't need to be here for the lift," Miles had told him earlier. "I do," Barker had replied without looking up. "Feels wrong not to." Miles didn't argue. Barker's presence wasn't bravery or stubbornness. It was something quieter, a need to stand beside the machine that had nearly taken him, as if acknowledging its accident before trusting another hull. The engineers gathered around the damaged tank, mud squelching under their boots. The torn screen told the entire story without words. The canvas failed under a sudden asymmetric load. The frame twisted before the driver could compensate. The river finished what the wind started. Miles explained the sequence to the senior sapper inspecting the frame. "It wasn't the current, it was the combination," he said. "Wind pressure from above, flow pressure from the side, and just enough weight shift to break equilibrium." The sapper tapped the torn metal. "Doesn't take much." "No," Miles said. "Not when the machine is fighting every element at once." He opened his notebook, flipping to the page he had filled the night before. A new diagram outlining reinforcement of the screen's upper edge, a redistributed ballast plan to lower the bow's sensitivity to chop, and a revised entry method to reduce initial instability. Every modification alone was small. Together they meant the difference between sinking and surviving. By late morning, the modifications were underway. Welding torches flared beneath the gray sky. Canvas was stretched, cut, and stitched. Mechanics crawled through the hull, adjusting weight distribution with a precision more common in peacetime shipyards than wartime testing grounds. Barker stayed close, helping wherever a third hand was needed. Major Selkirk, watching from a distance, looked increasingly impatient. "Captain," he finally said, pulling Miles aside, "I assume these changes will be validated today?" "They will be tested," Miles answered. "Validation will take more than one river and one attempt." Selkirk's jaw tightened. "High Command won't accept indefinite testing, especially when this project competes with others for resources." Miles held his gaze. "Sir, if we cross the Rhine successfully with armor, every soldier on the far bank lives longer. If we fail, thousands will pay for our shortcuts. I'd rather fight rivers here than fight regret later." Selkirk didn't reply. He left the argument hanging in the cold air and returned to observing the work, silently conceding the point. By mid-afternoon, the modified tank was ready. The new screen frame held a firmer line, reinforced with thicker ribs. Ballast adjustments gave the hull a slightly different posture, lower at the rear, marginally higher at the bow, subtle enough that only trained eyes would recognize the difference. Barker ran his hand along the canvas, knuckles brushing the new seams. "She feels steadier," he said. "She will be steadier," Miles corrected, "but only if we respect what happened yesterday." There were no speeches before the trial. The men were too cold, too focused, and too aware of the risk. But there was a sharper silence. Not fear, exactly, but the quiet of people who understood they were stepping into a place where mistakes were unforgiving. The tank rolled forward, its engine rumbling patiently. The river waited, deceptive in its calmness, as if curious what humans would try next. "Take her in," Miles said. The Sherman entered the water more cautiously this time, the bow testing the surface, nudging the current before committing. The canvas tightened into a firm arc as the hull floated free. Barker breathed slowly inside the driver's position, feeling every vibration. The wind was lighter than yesterday, but not absent. It brushed the screen in long strokes. "Begin throttle," Miles called. The propellers churned, and the hull angled into the flow. The tank drifted a fraction, then corrected. Barker worked through the new procedure. Smaller rudder adjustments, steadier throttle changes, smoother control over the bow's line. The river pushed. The tank pushed back. For a moment the canvas quivered. The men with ropes tensed. A memory of the sinking flickered through every mind. Barker adjusted a fraction of a second sooner than before, following the modified doctrine. The hull settled. The quiver vanished. Miles let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The tank crept upstream, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a deliberate strength that felt different from the earlier attempts. It was not fighting the river violently. It was working with the unseen contours of the flow, slipping into the slower threads, using the hull trim to redirect pressure instead of resisting it outright. Barker's voice crackled over the intercom speaker on the bank. "She wants to drift left, but she's holding. Throttle steady. Rudder 2 degrees right. Still climbing." The officers leaned forward, as if by instinct. The tank reached the painted marker on the far bank, the same line it had crossed in triumph once and failed to reach the next day. It passed it. Miles checked his watch. Longer sustained movement, better angle, lower bow impact, screen holding perfectly, engine temperature stable. But the trial wasn't complete yet. "Bring her about," Miles ordered. This was the most dangerous maneuver, turning mid-current, where the river gathered enough force in its center to overturn anything that exposed the wrong angle. Barker eased the hull through the turn, propellers whining as they fought to keep the bow above the chop. The nose dipped once, twice, but never lost control. The reinforced frame kept the screen taut, refusing the river the opening it had exploited before. The tank completed the turn. The river had been denied. Barker guided the hull toward the bank. The bow scraped gravel gently. The engine dropped to a deep idle. No one cheered. Not because the moment lacked significance, but because they understood how fragile these victories were. Rivers allowed success reluctantly, and only for those who respected them. Barker climbed out of the hatch, boots clanking on the hull. His hair was damp with sweat despite the cold. "She listens better now," he said. "Feels like the river can't grab hold the same way." Miles nodded. He didn't smile, but he let the relief reach his eyes. "This is the first time," Miles said softly. "I've seen her behave like a machine ready for war." Selkirk approached slowly, folding his notebook under his arm. "So it's possible," he said. Miles looked out at the river, which flowed on as if nothing important had happened. "It's possible," he said. "But we still haven't asked the river the hardest question." Selkirk exhaled sharply. "And that is?" "Whether she can cross under fire." The wind picked up again, drawing ripples across the water. Tomorrow the trial would change again. Not just river and weather, but noise, distraction, stress, and the unpredictability of wartime conditions. They would introduce simulated artillery blasts on the banks, timed smoke discharges, and the added weight of equipment meant to mimic real combat loads. The river had been generous today. It would not be tomorrow. And that was exactly what they needed. The final trial began before dawn, in a darkness so complete that the river itself seemed to vanish. Only the sound of moving water revealed its presence, a steady, low rush that blended with the distant rumble of trucks arriving with equipment for the day. Frost covered the banks in a thin white sheet, crunching under every boot step. The men moved quietly, their breath forming pale clouds in the cold air. They knew this would be the hardest test yet. Miles walked along the river's edge with a lantern in hand, its glow barely reaching the surface. He paused often, listening rather than looking. The river sounded heavier than previous mornings. After last night's rain upstream, the current had grown stronger, carrying faint debris that knocked against the bank. This was the closest they would get to real combat water without crossing into actual combat. Behind him, sappers assembled smoke pots along the shoreline. Artillery crews prepared blank charges. Mechanics adjusted weights in the test tank to bring its load closer to wartime configuration. Ammunition equivalents, spare track sections, extra fuel cans, and radio equipment. The hull sat lower as a result, the flotation screen straining against the added mass. Barker arrived last, carrying his helmet under one arm. He looked tired but steady. The day he escaped the sinking tank had left something in his eyes, not fear, but a kind of respect for what they were trying to control. He touched the hull with the same caution as approaching a sleeping animal. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Miles said. "If she can handle today, she can handle anything the Rhine throws at her." "And if she can't?" Miles tightened the strap on one of the ballast boxes. "Then we learn again." The river gave them no hint of which outcome it preferred. When daylight finally pushed through the clouds, the trial began. The tank was rolled toward the water, engine idling in a tense mechanical heartbeat. The officers gathered behind a makeshift blast shelter. Smoke pots were lit. Sappers stood ready with signaling flags in case visibility collapsed completely. The test would simulate everything but real bullets. "Take her in," Miles said. The Sherman entered the river with deliberate caution. The screen held firm. Barker followed the modified entry angle, letting the river take the bow for a moment before asserting control. The hull aligned more quickly than before. Not perfectly, but with a confidence that hadn't existed 2 weeks ago. Then the river struck back. A gust of wind hit first, pushing sideways against the canvas. Barker adjusted instantly, correcting rudder angle. The hull wavered but didn't drift. The new ballast kept the bow from dipping. Miles nodded once. A good start. Too good, the river seemed to think. A sapper blew a whistle, and the first artillery charge detonated on the near bank. The explosion thudded through the ground, sending ripples across the surface. Smoke rolled out, thick and gray, hiding parts of the river from view. Barker tightened his grip on the controls. The second blast came from farther upstream. The shockwave reached the hull with a muffled thump. The tank rocked, then steadied. Barker eased throttle, then increased it, adjusting for the changing flow. The river was moving faster beneath the smoke, the rain-fed surge pulling harder at the hull. "Keep angle," Miles called from the bank. "Don't fight the flow too early." Barker acknowledged with a curt nod, even though Miles couldn't see him through the haze. He guided the hull into a slower seam of water, almost blind. The tank drifted sideways, then corrected, each movement deliberate. The river tried to take control, but the new trim and weight distribution kept instability from forming. It was a delicate dance, the kind where each wrong step ended underwater. The third blast echoed across the field. This time it was paired with the hiss of smoke pots releasing thick white cover along the far bank. The world narrowed to silhouettes and ghost-like patches of movement on the water. Barker had no visual reference now, only the pulse of the engine, the vibration through the controls, and the faint resistance of the river against the hull. "Miles," Selkirk shouted through the fog. "He's losing sight." "He doesn't need sight," Miles answered. "He knows the river." Barker kept the tank on course, feeling the resistance build on the port side. He shifted trim a fraction, nudged the rudder, and held steady as the hull crept upstream. It was slower than previous days, painfully slow, but it was progress in conditions that would have sunk any unmodified machine. "Distance?" Miles called. A sapper checked the stake line, barely visible through the haze. 7 meters upstream, sir." Selkirk muttered something Miles didn't catch. It sounded like disbelief. The river responded with a surge, a long, heavy push that rocked the hull harder than anything before. Barker gritted his teeth. The canvas trembled. The bow dipped. For a terrible second, the tank began to repeat the motion that preceded the sinking. Then Barker made a change. Not a large one, not a desperate one. He simply adjusted throttle in a tiny pulse, a momentary surge of power paired with a subtle shift in angle, the kind of movement no manual could teach, the kind learned only by the men who had spent weeks listening to the river. The hull stabilized. The bow lifted. The canvas tightened. The river failed to take hold. The tank continued its slow climb. The visibility improved as the smoke drifted. The officers leaned forward, seeing the impossible with their own eyes. A 40-ton tank advancing upstream through smoke, shockwaves, wind, current, and chop. Not fighting the water, but navigating through its layered paths like a creature born in it. 15 meters, someone called. 17! 19! Miles stared at his stopwatch. This was far longer, far more difficult than any scenario they had tested before. "That's enough," he shouted. "Turn her around." This was the final proof. If the tank could turn mid-current under these conditions, it was ready. Barker eased the hull into the turn. The river pushed hard against the bow, trying to pin it, but the reinforced frame held. The ballast distribution prevented the list from becoming a dive. The engine growled as Barker timed the thrust just right. The hull completed the turn. It moved back toward the near bank. Smoke thinned. The river calmed its tone, as if acknowledging the outcome. The tank reached the landing point and bumped against the gravel with a quiet scrape. Barker shut down the engine. The silence that followed was thicker than any explosion. Men approached slowly, as though approaching something sacred. Barker climbed out, boots splashing lightly in the shallows. His face was pale but steady. "That," he said, catching his breath, felt like crossing a river with a will of its own. Miles put a hand on the hull. It was warm from the engine and cold from the water at the same time, a contradiction that suited the entire project. Selkirk stepped closer, his earlier impatience gone. "Captain Miles," he said, "you've built a machine that can do what no river ever intended to allow." Miles shook his head. "Not built, learned. We just taught steel how rivers think." The major looked at him strangely, but didn't argue. Word of the trial spread quickly, reaching the divisions preparing for the final push into Germany. The 79th Armored Division adopted the improved methods. Variants of Miles's adjustments were applied across multiple units. On the Rhine, when armored vehicles faced fast water under fire, crews used the same angles, the same trim, the same patience learned on this quiet English river. Not every crossing was perfect. Not every river was kind, but far fewer tanks were lost than anyone had predicted. And within the quiet archives of wartime engineering, a simple line entered the record. Modified DD tanks demonstrated stable upstream maneuver under adverse conditions. Miles kept his notebook, though he rarely opened it again. Barker returned to his unit, carrying the memory of a river that tried to swallow him and the machine that learned, eventually, to climb through its current. No plaques were made. No headlines were written. The story lived only in the minds of the men who watched steel behave like something lighter than water and heavier than fate. But sometimes, years later, on a wet morning with a gray sky, Miles would walk along the Thames or some other river and watch how the water slid around stones and pilings. And he would smile, just slightly, knowing that once, on a forgotten stretch of English shoreline, a tank had learned to move like that too.